The winds of war swept across Scotland in the late 13th century. What began as a question of royal succession soon spiraled into a struggle for sovereignty, identity, and survival. At the heart of it all stood one man, Edward I of England. Ruthless, calculating, and unyielding, Edward saw Scotland not as a neighbour, but as a kingdom to be absorbed, its crown subordinate to his own. In 1296, Edward launched a full-scale invasion of Scotland, claiming the right to intervene in its politics. He marched north with an army and a purpose, to remind the Scots who held true power on the island of Britain. Towns like Berwick-upon-Tweed bore the brunt of his fury. Berwick was not merely taken, it was annihilated. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in the thousands, a clear message from the English king that resistance would be crushed without mercy. But the Scots did not bow easily. Though their chosen king, John Balliol, was humiliated and deposed, a new kind of leadership emerged, one not born of royal blood, but of sheer will. William Wallace, a knight of obscure origin, galvanized a rebellion. In 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, his forces struck a stunning blow against Edward's might, proving that Scottish defiance was far from broken. Edward responded with calculated fury. He regrouped and crushed Wallace's forces at Falkirk a year later. Wallace would go underground, captured years later and executed in London. Yet even then, Scotland would not kneel. Another figure, Robert the Bruce, rose from within the nobility, rekindling the fight that Edward had hoped to extinguish. But why did Edward wage such brutal campaigns? What forged a king so relentless in conquest, so unwavering in authority? To understand the hammer of the Scots, we must journey back, beyond the battlefield, before the bloodshed. Edward was born on June 17, 1239, at the Palace of Westminster. He was the firstborn son of King Henry III and Eleanor of Provence. From the moment of his birth, Edward carried the weight of a legacy. He was named after Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king to rule England before the Norman conquest. But the England into which Edward was born was far from stable. His father, Henry III, had been king since childhood and spent much of his reign at odds with his barons. He was seen as weak, overly generous to foreign advisors, and inconsistent in his rule. The royal finances were often in shambles, and tensions between crown and nobility simmered throughout Edward's youth. Despite these political tremors, Edward's early years were relatively secure. He was raised in a royal court infused with French culture, courtesy of his mother's Provençal heritage. He was taught Latin, history, theology, and the responsibilities of kingship. But Edward's education was not limited to books. From an early age, he trained in horsemanship, hunting, and the art of war. He was tall even as a child, and grew into a striking, physically commanding young man. His towering frame and straight posture would one day earn him the nickname Longshanks, a symbol of both his height and his looming authority. By his teenage years, Edward's future was being shaped by political necessity. In 1254, at just 15 years old, he was married to Eleanor of Castile, the daughter of King Ferdinand III of Castile and Joan of Ponthieu. The marriage was not merely a dynastic alliance, it was part of a broader plan by Henry III to strengthen English claims and influence in the contested region of Gascony in southwestern France. Despite its political roots, the union between Edward and Eleanor was unusually affectionate for a royal marriage. The two were nearly inseparable for much of their married life, and Eleanor would accompany Edward on nearly all his campaigns, even his crusade to the Holy Land. Back home in England, the political situation was unraveling. The king's mismanagement and favoritism toward foreign advisors had pushed the English barons toward open resistance. Chief among them was Simon de Montfort, the king's brother-in-law, who began to lead the baronial opposition. In 1258, the barons forced Henry III to accept the provisions of Oxford, a set of reforms that would limit royal authority and establish a council of barons to oversee governance. At first, Edward sympathized with their cause. Young and idealistic, he was drawn to the idea of reform and justice, but his loyalty would not last. As the conflict deepened into open power struggles, Edward began to see Montfort not as a reformer, but as a rival to royal power. Over the next few years, Edward's political instincts sharpened. He began to understand the complex dance between force and negotiation, loyalty and betrayal. By 1264, England was on the brink of collapse, and at the age of 24, Edward was no longer just the heir to the throne. He was a rising political and military figure in his own right. In May of 1264, that tension exploded into open war. At the Battle of Lewes, Edward led the royal cavalry. At first, the prince's aggressive charge scattered de Montfort's left flank. But he pursued the fleeing troops too far, losing contact with the main battle. When he returned, it was too late. The royal army had been overwhelmed, and Edward himself was forced to surrender. King Henry and Prince Edward were taken prisoner. For the next several months, de Montfort effectively ruled England. Edward, however, did not stay captive for long. In May 1265, while under relatively relaxed custody at Hereford, Edward made a daring escape during a hunting trip. Once escaped, Edward wasted no time. He rallied loyalist barons, raised an army, and within weeks was marching against his enemies. The final reckoning came at the Battle of Evesham on August 4, 1265. Edward led the royalist forces in a brutal, decisive confrontation. De Montfort's army, outmaneuvered and outnumbered, was annihilated. The Earl himself was cut down in battle, his body mutilated on the field. Edward's triumph was absolute. The rebel cause collapsed, and the royal government was restored. But Edward did not act with blind vengeance. While some rebels were punished harshly, others were offered pardons. Over the next several years, Edward helped restore royal authority while slowly stepping into a more dominant leadership role. His father remained king, but the realm increasingly looked to Edward as its true master. With the Civil War behind him, Edward turned his eyes abroad. In 1270, he joined his uncle Louis IX of France on the Eighth Crusade, a campaign aimed at reinforcing Christian power in the Holy Land. Though the crusade ultimately failed to make lasting gains, Edward distinguished himself in battle and diplomacy. In 1271, while in Acre, he survived an assassination attempt by a Syrian assassin, who stabbed him with a poisoned dagger. Edward killed the attacker, but nearly died from the wound. While Edward was still abroad, news reached him in 1272. His father, King Henry III, was dead. Edward was now King of England, did not rush home. The realm was stable and his authority secure. Edward finally landed in England in 1274. He was no longer just a prince or a crusader. He was King Edward I, a seasoned leader shaped by rebellion, war, and survival. When Edward I returned to England, he inherited a kingdom in relative peace, but not yet in order. The scars of civil war remained, the nobility was restless, the courts inconsistent, and royal finances strained. He moved quickly. In 1275, Edward summoned Parliament and enacted the Statute of Westminster, a sweeping set of laws that targeted corruption, streamlined property disputes, and reinforced feudal obligations. The patchwork justice of his father's reign would be replaced by a standardized legal system, one that extended royal authority into every corner of the realm. But Edward's ambitions extended beyond England's borders. To the west lay the Principality of Wales, divided among native princes and marcher lords. For centuries, English kings had struggled to bring Wales fully under their control. The turning point came in 1277, when Edward launched a campaign against Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the Prince of Gwynedd and the most powerful Welsh ruler of his time. Llywelyn had refused to pay homage to Edward and had married the daughter of Simon de Montfort, Edward's old enemy. For the English king, it was both a political defiance and a personal insult. Edward responded with overwhelming force. He raised a massive army and invaded from multiple fronts. Faced with such pressure, Llywelyn was forced to submit. The resulting Treaty of Aberconwy left him weakened but still in possession of part of his territory. For a few years, peace held, but only briefly. In 1282, a fresh rebellion broke out across Wales, this time broader and more desperate. Llywelyn joined the uprising, but it was a fatal mistake. Edward responded with brutal efficiency. His forces pushed deep into Welsh heartlands, and by the end of the year, Llywelyn was dead, killed in battle in central Wales. His brother Dafydd tried to carry on the resistance, but was captured, dragged through the streets of Shrewsbury and executed for treason. In 1284, Edward issued the Statute of Rhuddlan, formally annexing Wales into the English crown. It abolished native Welsh law, replaced it with English institutions, and created new counties under direct royal control. Wales, after centuries of resistance, was now part of the English kingdom. To seal his conquest symbolically, Edward staged a moment of political theatre. In Caernarfon Castle in 1284, his wife Eleanor gave birth to a son, Edward of Caernarfon. A year later, Edward would declare this infant the first Prince of Wales, a title still borne by the heir to the British throne today. Edward had achieved what no English king before him had managed. He had conquered Wales and brought it under lasting control. But conquest had only whetted his appetite. To the north lay Scotland, a kingdom whose independence Edward would soon challenge with equal determination and even greater bloodshed. In 1286, the Kingdom of Scotland was thrown into uncertainty. King Alexander III died after falling from his horse during a night journey along the Fife coast. His only surviving heir was his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, just 3 years old. Her mother had died in childbirth, and Margaret had been raised in the Norwegian court. With no adult successor in Scotland, the throne was suddenly vulnerable, and Edward I of England saw an opportunity. Edward positioned himself as a neutral arbitrator, offering to help the Scots avoid civil war. In truth, he was maneuvering for control. In 1290, he negotiated the Treaty of Berghem, which proposed a marriage between his son, Edward of Caernarfon, and young Margaret. The treaty promised to maintain Scottish independence, but Edward clearly hoped that through marriage, Scotland would fall under English influence. But fate intervened. On her voyage to Scotland, the young Margaret fell ill and died in Orkney. Her death triggered a full-blown succession crisis. 13 claimants came forward, each with their own argument for the throne. The two strongest were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, both descended from David I of Scotland. To prevent war, the Scottish lords invited Edward to arbitrate the decision. Edward agreed, but with conditions. He demanded that the Scottish nobility recognize him as overlord of Scotland. Desperate to avoid civil conflict, the Scottish leaders agreed, though many did so reluctantly. In 1292, Edward chose John Balliol as king, but Edward made it clear that Balliol was no independent monarch. The new king was summoned to English courts, overruled on internal matters, and treated as a vassal, not a sovereign. The Scots began to call him Túm Tabard, the empty coat. By 1295, the humiliation was too much. Balliol broke with Edward and formed an alliance with France, England's traditional enemy. In 1296, Edward invaded Scotland with overwhelming force. At Berwick-upon-Tweed, his army massacred thousands in one of the bloodiest sackings of the era. The English swept through southern Scotland, defeating Balliol at the Battle of Dunbar and forcing him to surrender. Balliol was publicly stripped of his royal insignia and sent into exile in England. Edward had crushed resistance and seized the Stone of Scone, the ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, taking it to Westminster Abbey as a trophy. But the conquest was far from complete. In the months that followed, local resistance began to grow. One name began to circulate among the common folk: William Wallace, a lesser noble and guerrilla fighter who led uprisings in the central lowlands. Wallace was no king, but his leadership galvanized a population weary of English rule. In 1297, Wallace and his ally Andrew Moray led Scottish forces to a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Edward was not in Scotland at the time, but the defeat was a blow to his authority. Later that year, Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. For the first time since Edward's invasion, Scotland had regained some semblance of national leadership. But Wallace's success would be short-lived. In 1298, Edward personally led a massive army north. He met Wallace's forces at the Battle of Falkirk. This time, English longbowmen proved decisive. Wallace was defeated and forced into hiding. By 1298, Edward I had restored some order in Scotland, but it was a victory without finality. The rebellion had been bruised, but not broken. William Wallace, though defeated at Falkirk, remained at large. In the years that followed, he maintained a near-constant pressure on Scotland. Fortresses were rebuilt, garrisons stationed, and punitive raids carried out. Edward summoned parliaments to fund the war, levied new taxes, and tightened his grip on the north. But with each year, the campaign became more costly and more complicated. In 1305, after years in hiding and betrayal by allies, William Wallace was captured near Glasgow. Edward had not forgotten Falkirk or Wallace's defiance. The rebel leader was brought to London, tried for treason, and subjected to one of the most brutal executions in English history. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. His body was mutilated, and his limbs sent to four corners of the kingdom as a warning. Edward may have believed that Wallace's death would end the resistance, but he was wrong. In 1306, another rival emerged, this time from within Scotland's noble class. Robert the Bruce, grandson of one of the original claimants to the throne, murdered his main rival John Comyn at a church altar in Dumfries. Days later, Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone. It was an audacious move and a direct challenge to Edward's authority. Edward was furious. Despite being in poor health, he rallied his army and prepared to march north once more. He saw Bruce not as a king, but as a traitor who had committed sacrilege and rebellion in one stroke. The king, now nearly 70, was suffering from a range of ailments. In July 1307 at Berg by Sands, just south of the Scottish border, Edward died in his camp. According to chroniclers, his dying wish was that his bones be carried into battle, so he might still lead the English in death if not in life, though this command was never fulfilled. After his death, Robert the Bruce would continue the fight, and eventually triumph at Bannockburn in 1314 against Edward's son, Edward II, a king who would not live up to his father's legacy.